The terminal or the command line can be a very powerful tool, not just for working with computer programs that you've written, but for working with files in a file system or processing different data or lots of other different possible things. We're going to look at just some of the most basic terminal commands here. First off, for our purposes, using Jupyter Notebooks, we can access a terminal by, in the main Jupyter landing page, going to New and selecting Terminal, which we've seen a couple of times when we did earlier labs and things. There are many other ways that you can access a terminal. For example, if you're using a Unix-based operating system like Linux or Mac OS X, then you can start up a terminal from your operating system. And there are plenty of other ways that you could get to a terminal. Windows even has its own terminal system, but it uses a different set of commands. These commands will not work in the Windows command prompt. The main focus that we'll talk about for this section is navigating a file system inside of the terminal. So to step back away from the idea of the terminal for a minute, your computer executes and uses and loads lots of different files, as we've done in our code, as you've probably done many, many times in a word processor or in a visual file navigator system, as comes it built into most operating systems. And if you've used Windows or Mac OS, then you're probably used to navigating file systems through a visual interface. But you can navigate those same sorts of structures, directories and subdirectories with files stored in them, using command line tools, using the terminal. Here is just a list of some of the different terminal commands, and you may want to come back to this as a reference at later points. You can do things like list all of the files in the current directory, print out the current working directory, that's just wherever you're currently located, because unlike your visual interface, you're not always going to see exactly where you're located at the moment in your file system. So there's a command to tell you, what directory am I actually in? You can change directories, make new directories, remove things, copy things, move things, and even load up files. We'll see a few examples of that. So to reiterate, the terminal is not showing you a separate file system. It's not some magical other space that you're navigating. It's the same file system that you would be using a visual interface to navigate. So when we open a terminal in Jupyter, it's looking at the same folders, the same directories and files as what you see in your visual display when you load up Jupyter, and you might see your different lab directories and any other directories that you might have created in there, like for your own projects or things like that. The terminal allows you to navigate those and to do things with the directories and the files in that structure. So at any time you are inside of a directory, also sometimes called a folder. When you're in the terminal, you can use ls to see the files and folders that are inside of your current directory. So just like the Jupyter display shows you the files and the folders of wherever you've clicked to, if you move around from place to place in the terminal, you can use ls to get that same display of what files and what folders are currently available to you. So the first thing that you're probably going to want to be able to do is to move around from one directory to another. You can use the cd or change directory command to do that. You say cd and where you would like to go. Sometimes this is relative to your current location. So you can move to a subdirectory of your current directory that way. Or sometimes you're using sort of absolute locations, like the root of the file system, the very base location for all files and folders, or things like that. I'll sometimes use folder and directory interchangeably. I'll try to be consistent, but remember that they often mean the same thing, and for my purposes here, they mean the same thing. So if you're in some current directory and that directory contains a subdirectory named CS128, then you can change into the CS128 directory by typing the command cd CS128 and then hitting enter. You'll do this often, for instance, to move into your lab directories. You can say cd lab 7, whatever. It needs to be the complete name of that directory. One thing worth noting is that if you've typed a partial name, for any time we're doing a command, if you type the partial name of a file or of a directory and hit tab, it will either complete it if there is only one possibility, or it may suggest multiple options of what that could be completed to. So for instance, the labs often have long names for their directories, things like lab 7 space dash space file projects or something like that. And so you can start typing lab 7 and then hit tab and it will attempt to complete it for you. If there's only one thing that starts with lab 7, it will just go ahead and complete the whole thing. Capitalization is important. So is including things like dashes or underscores or numbers that are in the directory name as well. You can go out of the current directory which you are in. So for example, if I was in one of the lab directories and I wanted to go back out to my main directory, then I use ... as the directory name. That tells it to go up one level, sort of like going back in a visual navigating system. So if you were in the CS128 directory that existed, let's say, inside of your home directory, then you can type cd space ... and hit enter, and it will take you back up to your home directory. A single dot always refers to the current location. So for instance, we can use the cp or copy command to copy a file. Here what we are doing is we are saying copy this long file. You'll notice that it's relative to Dave's home directory, a subdirectory of that, and then a file name. So there are multiple pieces to this one, and that's why it's so long. But it's telling it where do we want to get the file from to copy it, and then where do we want that copy to live? Where do we want that copy to go? And here in this example, we are saying ... We would like it to go here, our current directory. You often will want to check and make sure that you're in the directory that you expect to be in by doing the pwd, print working directory command, before you do a copy like this. Otherwise, we would not want to use the ... if we're not sure of where we're located currently and we don't want to check it. We would not use the ... We would use some full directory name, like using my username /CS128 or something like that. So the copy command requires two things. Where is the file coming from that we're going to copy? What's the source? And then what's the destination? Where do we want it to go? So this copy is iliad.txt from Dave's directory to whatever current directory you're in when you run that command. If I change directories and run that command again, I'll get another copy in that directory that I've changed to. As I just sort of hinted at, but to say it more explicitly, the slashes in these indicate subdirectories. So for instance, we can say ./CS128, and that will say, I would like this file to go into the CS128 directory, which is a subdirectory of dot of my current directory. And this over here tells us we're starting in Dave's personal directory. That's what the tilde and then the username means. And from there, we're looking at CS128 share, and we're finding iliad.txt, and then we're going to put a copy of it here in the CS128 directory. The tilde alone will always refer to you, the current user's home directory. You could be explicit in this. So I believe my username is just Sophia Lemons. I could say tilde Sophia Lemons, and that would refer to my home directory. Just like before, we saw that the tilde and Dave's username referred to Dave's home directory. But if I'm the user logged in, I can just use the tilde. It's a shorthand. It's an abbreviation for saying my home directory. So this here, for example, if you get lost sort of in the directory structure and you just want to jump back to your home directory, you can type cd space tilde and then hit enter, and it will take you right back to your home directory. So it's a good way to sort of reset to a place where you know your main home directory. This would be the one that loads up as the display when you load Jupyter. That's your home directory. All of those labs and files that show there when you load Jupyter, that's your home directory. The mv or move command allows you to relocate or rename a file or a directory. So it's called move, but if you think about it, if you're moving within the same directory, you're essentially just renaming. So here we've got a few different examples. We change directory to our home directory. Whichever user is logged in, it's going to take us to their home directory. Then we're going to copy a folder. This is copying the CS128 folder into CS128 copy. When we copy folders, we often want to also copy the files that are inside of them. This uses an option to be recursive. So copy everything inside of CS128, not just an empty directory or not just the name of the directory, essentially. Then you see here that we changed our mind. We wanted to move CS128 copy to instead be called CS128 backup. So this just renames it because we're not telling it a new location, really. We're just telling it, move it from being this name to being that name. Whereas down here, we're going to actually move a file to a different location. We change directories to CS128. Then we move, meaning rename here, iliad.txt to data.txt. So that's a rename because we didn't tell it a new directory. Then down here, I move data.txt to up one directory, CS128 backup. So now I've taken it out of my current directory. I've moved it up a directory into that backup folder that I made up above, that backup directory that I made up above. So that actually moves it to a different place. One other thing that I want you to be aware of when working in the terminal, because we'll often be dealing with files that are just plain text. All of the TXT files that we use, all of the DAT files, DAT files that we use, and in fact, all plain Python code files, not necessarily the Jupyter Notebook code files, but .py files are also just plain text. In fact, from this class, the end of this class onward, chances are most of the code that you write will actually be in files that are just plain text, but you compile them, you use them as code, you give them a different extension, and you tell your computer, run it with Python, or run it as Java or that kind of thing. But if you think about what we're typing in, we're only typing in text when we write code. And so it's very useful to have some good tools for looking at plain text in the terminal. And we'll see some more advanced ways of manipulating text files and plain text files and code files that are essentially plain text in the future. But for now, the most important one for you will be this tool called more. Sometimes you have very long files, and if you just tell the system to list out all of the information from that file, it will fly right past you on the screen and you'll never get to stop and see what you actually wanted to see. You may have to end up scrolling up huge amounts to get back to the part of the file that you actually cared about. So there are a few different tools for looking at text slower. One of them is more. And so that will load you a screen's worth of the file at a time. And then you can use things like arrows, up and down arrows, and the space bar, and page up, page down, and things like that to navigate through the file and look at the contents that are there for the file a little bit at a time, rather than it just all flooding right past you and having to scroll around through it. As I say, there are other tools for looking at plain text. I personally prefer the more advanced tool called less. It's a little bit of a joke as a name. But either more or less will show you parts of the file, a screen's worth at a time, so that it's not flooding past you as you're trying to read through things. So we've seen here that there are some basic tools for moving around between different directories, like the cd command. There are tools for copying things and creating copies of some file that exists already in the file system using the cp command. We can move or rename things using the mv command. And we can do other stuff to try to navigate and figure out where we are and make the spaces, the directories and stuff that we want. And then to look at the contents of things as well with tools like more or less that allow us to see bits of a file at a time and read through it at a pace that makes sense for us.